That's good. That's good. I will let you intro. Apologies.
So, welcome everyone to SQL Friday. This is, I need to look it up. I think it's number 102. I'm really happy to have Heidi
Heidi.
Hasting,
I respond to both.
who is connecting from literally the other side of the world from me. So it's cool. I like meeting people in person, but it's a bit more handy to be able to connect like this. This is your first time on SQL Friday, and I'm really happy you're on. We met in Seattle a couple of months ago. So, and I just saw the dates for the next time, so I hope to meet you there again. But here we are. You're going to talk about sensitivity labels in different places, or how you can use them in different places.
Yes, I am. Now, I'm going to share screen. I will flick it.
I could try to do an intro of you, but I think you'll do it much better. So I'll leave that to you.
Oh, good. Oh, good. Yeah, you've probably worked out, everyone. As has been pointed out, I am on the other side of the world, hence the accent. I am Australian. Don't worry if you thought I was New Zealander. I have no offence to that because got a lot of good mates over in New Zealand, so no offence taken. Today, I'm going to cover sensitivity labels. Now, I do this talk at various speeds, so I'll try and keep it at an hour. It might even go under. But if you have questions and you feel comfortable jumping off mute, you're more than welcome to. Otherwise, drop them in the chat. I can see the chat, so I'll try and keep an eye on it in case you have questions. And if you don't have questions, that's okay. It's a lot to take in. So a little bit about me. I work for a consulting company here in Australia called Expose. We are Australia-wide. You can find me on Twitter. Yes, I still use Twitter. I have no qualms in using Twitter. I'm a business intelligence pro. I formerly was a software developer, so I come at things from that coder background. I love all things application lifecycle management, database lifecycle management. Wow, joining from Mexico. That's awesome, Fernando. And an Azure DevOps fan. You'll find me at tech events all over the world. If you're ever heading to Seattle, feel free to say hi. If you find me, I may have changed my hair color. Like since you've seen me in person, I've changed my hair color. I now have the blue. So it's no surprise if I've changed my hair color all around the world. Wow, 5 a.m. devotion. I love it. So it's 9:30 p.m. here. Just for a bit of a guide, I'm not from the eastern states where most Australians you'll meet are from. I am from the centre down the bottom in Adelaide. There's a couple of other data platform MVPs here in Little Old Adelaide, and I love it. So we're gonna talk about sensitivity labels from the perspective of what it looks like in the data platform. I mean, ages ago, I saw a demo on sensitivity labels for Office 365, sort of how you do it in SharePoint and your emails. And I thought, oh, yeah, that's interesting. Now, at the time, it wasn't applicable to the data platform. And now it's becoming more and more applicable. And I thought, let's explore what it looks like so that I know how to implement it and roll it out. But I also know how my users are going to experience it and then how I can communicate that to other people in an organization. So we're going to look at things like Power BI, Azure SQL, a little bit about Purview, Office 365, because that's where we set them up. And so let's head into what they are if you've never heard about them before. If you've never heard about a sensitivity label, the crux of it, it's just a label. It's something that you can use to classify, different artifacts, whether it be documents, Excel files, Word files, PowerPoint files, Power BI files, so your PBIX files. It's also something you can use to give your users a bit more metadata about what they're looking at. So you can have the labels. For example, it might be confidential, public, it might be things like, GDPR regulation stuff, it might be for Australians, IRAP regulations, or it might be whatever your organisation defines as their information classification policy. It's not really used to provide security, though, when it comes to the data platform. So if you're ever reading it, it will talk about security in the context of sensitivity labels, but when it comes to the data platform specifically, not so much. There are tiny elements of security, but at the end of the day, it's mostly just a label. Licensing is an interesting one when it comes to this because it sits within Office 365. If you have a single E5 license on your tenancy that you're using, sensitivity labels are enabled. Otherwise, it would have previously been Azure Information Protection Plans P1 and P2. I think that might have been renamed recently, but you do have to have a single license on your tenant to enable the feature. Once it's enabled, when you come to Power BI, it has specific licensing considerations. So it's going to want you to have Pro or Premium per user to be able to apply and use the labels. So do check out the licensing, and I'll show you a little bit what it looks like if you don't have a license versus if you do have a license, so you can play around in your organizations or your demo tenant and go, where's my label? I don't have the feature. Oh, it's because perhaps I don't have the licensing. Or if your organization does have the licensing, you'll know the buttons are all enabled, and away you go, you can have a bit of a play. There is a nice little process that Microsoft put together when it comes to using sensitivity labels. It's basically a little three-stepper. So you've got your administration where you want to create the labels. It's a two-step process within that, create and publish, and I'll go through that in a little bit more detail. There's the end user aspect, which is actually applying that label to files. And then there's other things where third-party things like Office is not really a third party to Microsoft, but Office and other third-party products can use that sensitivity label to apply a level of protection. And I'll contextualize that specific to data platform as we go through. The very first thing we want to do is the setup, because out of the box, even with the license, you have 0 labels applied. So it's a brand new clear slate to put things on. So you want to go to the Office 365 Admin Center. And then from within that, if you've never seen it, this is, I wanted to show people in case a lot of times this is done by your cloud admins, your global admins, or if you've got specifically Office 365 ones, so less data platform people play in that space. If you do, great. If you don't, this is how you're going to be talking to the people that do. They're going to go into the admin centers and go to compliance. Now, my screenshots are a little bit out of date on this next one because it would have been, I've updated this one. It's one later that I haven't updated. It was previously the Microsoft 365 Compliance Center. Now it's called Microsoft Purview. Very confusing when we have the Purview Data product about lineage and artifact recognition and all that sort of stuff, the governance around that, when it sits in the admin center. But is what it is. They've decided to slam everything together. So within there, you want to go down the bottom to information protection. Now, if you do get yourself a little bit lost and click things like data loss prevention, you'll see labels, but it's different to sensitivity labels. So you want to look at information protection, and then you're going to see this when you're in a brand new tenant, no labels. But this is where you're going to administer. So when it comes to creating a label, we've got label properties, so we can enter name and description. We can have the scope of a label, so whether it applies. Now, for context, the labels, because you're defining them in Office 365, it also means you're impacting Office 365. So SharePoint, Teams, Word, OneDrive, all that, as well as data platform, Purview, Power BI, or Power Platform, I should say, Power Platform and Data Platform. There's a got from the Azure SQL one. I'll talk about that. Protection for files, so whether you want any watermarks or any encryption, offline access, and then there's the publish step. When it comes to publishing, you're doing what's called creating a policy. Now, I think I've kept in this slide deck, we'll actually walk through setting one up. So you define which labels you're going to publish, then you define who's going to have access to them, and that can be users or groups or a combination thereof. You've got some policy settings you can do, some mandatory stuff, which is very cool when it comes to Power BI, because you can default this thing to say, make sure every single Power BI artifact has a sensitivity label like unclassified. So you can straight away tell your users this artifact in Power BI has not been reviewed, or if it does have a label, it's been classified accordingly to your information policy and some additional information. So let's set one up. So if we were back in Microsoft Purview, we would go in and say create a label. From there, we would define things like our name and our description. But one thing I wanted to point out is right down the bottom, the description for admins. So that's a great way to be able to communicate to the person administering the labels, who has authority to manage this label, who can change, who has access to it, what is its context, that sort of thing. Whereas the description for users is what you want the people actually using the label to do with it. Got your display name. This is an example of it filled in. So you'll see me use a confidential one throughout. It's just a label, but you think about that in what else could I put in this label? I might want to put this data set's about finance, this data set's about HR or people and culture, or it's about, you know, IT, might be about just data. You know, you can use this label for kind of anything. It is tied to your general information protection, but realistically, it's a label that you can put on artifacts in the data space. So then we define our scope. As I mentioned earlier, if you're going to use it in the data platform space, you want to tick this last checkbox, which applies to schematized data sets. So Purview is the main one that'll come up with that. Even though it talks about SQL and Azure SQL, there's a big gotcha on that one. So we'll cover that off later. We can talk about encryption, so whether you want things to be marked. Now, this content marking really doesn't apply on the data platform. I'll show you an example. It's more for things like Word. These are the settings that you get. Things like offline content is something you might want to explore. Let's say user gets a Power BI file, exports to Excel. That Excel file has a label applied. You might want to set the offline expiry to they can never use it offline, so that if that person leaves the organization, you don't have to worry about the Excel file sitting on their hard drive, because when they open that file, it's going to touch base with Office 365 and go, does this person still have access to this label? No, then don't let them see the contents. Is there a way around it? No idea, but just be aware of that. You may want to toggle this to no offline access to prevent someone accidentally having a file. Doesn't apply to Power BI in that, but does to Excel. We assign our permissions to the label. I won't go through that in great detail, but you get the gist. You can apply users and groups. And then this is an example of me setting it up for offline access for a day. We've got some details about the watermarking. The only reason I left this slide in was because with the watermark, some organizations might want to put specific styling rules on in terms of the color they use and the font size. It's really limited. So when you click the drop down on the font color, it's only about 5 to 10 colors. So it's not like you can play with every color in the playbook. You can only play with a subset. So just watch that if you've got a style guide that dictates the watermark approach. We can do auto labeling at the files. We can also define policies when it comes to SharePoint. Now I'm flicking through these because they don't really apply so much to the data platform. This one does, which is Purview. So it allows you to grant the permission to auto label. So within Purview, if you are using it, there is a concept of auto labeling. So when it's scanning your assets, it can also try and work out what labels should be applied based on what's in those assets, as well as some rules. I'm not going to cover that off because it's quite an in-depth one, but just be aware if it's possible to do a level of auto labeling. We go through and review our settings. All the details are all good. I'm good to go. Now we can go ahead and publish. And Microsoft's great in that it kind of gives you hints about what the next step should be as you finish through the little menus. So we go in and publish. I've said, yep, my sensitivity label I want to publish is going to be the confidential one. I'm going to publish that for all users in my organization. I'm not going to set anything here, but this is an example of what you could do. The reason this is good to see is because the top one will help you in terms of auditing. It'll help you in terms of training and everything, which is the justification. If someone changes the classification, say from confidential to something that's considered more open access like public, then you might want them to justify the reason for that so that you can see that in the logging around sensitivity labels, and then review that on a periodic basis to go, well, is it people are unsure how to do the labeling? Is it that people just want things to be more open? Is it that people just don't care? All those sorts of things. You might want to know why, because it might be your label policy is too granular or too broad and they're not sure how to label, or it might mean you might need to do some more training with your users. You can also indicate, third one down is another data one, which is around Power BI content. So you can make it so that users are required to apply a label to any Power BI content. That's kind of handy to know if you are looking at a governance rollout and you're doing your information protection. You may want to leave this off initially and then later down the track, give it 3-6 months to roll out and then go, right, it's now mandatory, and toggle that on. And also a bit later, you can actually default it. So you could make it mandatory, but default to say unclassified, and then communicate to users. If you see a report that's unclassified, consider it, use the data at your own risk. If you see it's got a label applied, it means it's already been vetted, been checked, and it's good for corporate consumption. We can also provide a custom help page. That might want to be a URL to an internal SharePoint site that describes the information protection policy that the company's using. Default labeling I talked about earlier, I'll skip through these, but basically each different artifact type, so your SharePoints, your OneDrives, your Office 365s, your emails, you can apply the default one, so you can indicate what default you want, and then you can name your policy. Important to name it because that's what you're going to see in the maintenance screens is what the policy was. We can review as we've done before, and now our new policy is created. Our label is now ready for consumption. Give it potentially 24 hours to actually flow through the organization, but now we have our labels. And so while you can see the labels there, also take note of the order. The order becomes important when you have, say, a Power BI report mashing up data sets from two different sensitivity labels. It will take the lowest number, which is the highest priority, as the sensitivity label to use in the consumption. But enough about the admin side. Let's get into what it looks like in the data products. First cab off the rank is Excel. Now, the reason I've put a little bracket store in blob storage is so that it ties into a screenshot later on about blob storage. But if you were to open Excel today and you look at the ribbon up the top, you see sensitivity. That, if it's grayed out, it either means one or two things. You're not signed in because you need to be signed in order for it to link to Office 365 to understand whether there are any sensitivity labels and whether your account has access to any of them. And the other thing is there might not be any. So you may not be licensed, your company might not have set any up, but those are sort of the key things. If you did have them set up, this is what it'd look like. Nice little enabled button, bit of a blue shade. With that, when you click on it, you will see the sensitivity labels for your organization. So this is just my demo tenant, and I've got one sensitivity label confidential. So that no one's confused, later on you'll see me have a whole bunch of NCIS named ones because I like NCIS. So that's a different tenant. The other thing to be aware of is make sure you signed into the correct tenant when you're doing your labeling. You don't want to sign into one tenant, label something, and then try and put it in another tenant. Make sure you've got the correct account if you're working across multiple accounts, multiple tenants. Once we do apply a sensitivity label in Excel, it will not only have it in the sensitivity drop down there in the ribbon, but it'll also put it in the status bar down the bottom left. So that's how, if someone sends you a file and you're like, is there a sensitivity label attached to this file? That's how you would see it, that bottom left of screen. This is where watermarks come in, is only with Word. So in the data platform, that watermark you won't see anywhere. But when you're in something like Word and you apply a sensitivity label using the same thing, the ribbon menu, you will see the watermark applied. You'll also see the confidential appear in the status bar down the bottom. Power BI. With Power BI, I'm talking the service and desktop, not Power BI Report Server. Unfortunately, Power BI Report Server is not applicable when it comes to sensitivity labels, or it wasn't at the time I put this presentation together. What is applicable in terms of the artifacts is dashboards and reports, Datamarts and data flows, and also paginated reports, but not workbooks. Now, Paginated Reports has a little caveat because the Power BI Report Builder does not allow you to apply a sensitivity label. So when you want to apply a sensitivity label to a Paginated report, you actually do it on the service itself. So we'll go through and look at what each of those sort of looks like so you get an idea of where the settings are, what it looks like, what a consuming user is going to see. I probably should pause and see if anyone has questions, but seeing as there's none in the chat, I assumed not, but feel free to chime in if anyone does. So with Power BI Desktop, looks very much like Excel. Don't worry, I took a screenshot from Power BI Desktop, hence why it's got the blue sort of shaded out as opposed to the grey. But again, if you're not signed in or you don't have any labels on your tenant, you get the grey disabled button in the ribbon. If you are logged in and you have sensitivity labels, you will see the labels that are applicable to you in the drop-down. Once you go apply a sensitivity label, just like Excel, they're very consistent across the products. Status bar down the bottom will indicate the sensitivity label that's been applied. So that's Power BI Desktop. Power BI Paginated Report Builder, Power BI Report Builder, I'll show a bit later, but we're going to skip and see what service has to say about things. So with Power BI Service, in order for it to recognize that you want to use sensitivity labels, there are a couple of tenant settings. So if you're not familiar with doing tenant administration, within Power BI, the service, top right, you'll see a little cog icon. If you have admin access, you'll go into that cog and hit the admin portal, which will show you this screen. Yeah, I've scrolled down a few menu settings, but under information protection, you will see the ability to allow users to apply sensitivity labels to content. So that needs to be enabled so that when you do publish Power BI desktop reports up that use sensitivity labeling, for it to recognize them has to be enabled. You get the ability to enable it for the entire org, or for the entire org minus a specific security group, or to a specific security group itself, plus or minus a exception security group. Fernando, how long would you say it'll take to set up sensitivity labels for BI? BI being business intelligence, I assume, let's say. So to actually set it up, like creating your labels, so I'll derail from this for a bit, to actually set it up, setting up your labels is only going to take you like 10 minutes. A lot of the conversations are going to occur up front with your governance team, if you have one, or with anyone like your data stewards or your information protection and potentially your cyber people, to actually work out, well, what are the labels we're going to have? Because you can have a lot of labels, but then think about that in terms of your organization maintaining them with Office 365, Power Platform, Data Platform. You want to keep it somewhat succinct so that your users are going to want to consume it, and you as an administrator don't want to have a scrolling screen of labels to pick from just because you administer them. So you might say, hey, we've got a regulatory governing body that our corporation works with. So GDPR, it might just be things like public, confidential, for official use only. What's another one? Sensitive medical, sensitive corporate, that sort of subset. Or it might be like in Australia, we have an IRAP protection, which lists out the various classifications. So you can leverage a pre-existing one that's aligned to the industry you work in, or you can create your own within your organization. So that part of the process is going to take quite a while for everyone to negotiate their sort of choices. Once that's done and you're actually rolling it out, creating the labels is quite quick. Then it's making them available to users and communicating and doing that cultural change. Now, that could be really quick or it could be quite long. So I would recommend with a lot of this, pilot it with a group of users. And you'll often find in a lot of organizations when they're going to look to do sensitivity labels, they're going to look to do it on email first. So potentially once they reach the data platform, users are already comfortable with doing it in things like email, SharePoint, those sorts of things. So a lot of your time is going to be the cultural shift. If you put on enforcement policies like this is mandatory for Power BI files, just be aware of the pushback your users might have. But you can put it in as mandatory, put a default classification like unclassified, and then regularly review the logs to look at, hey, have we got every single artifact assigned with unclassified? Then it means our policy is not working. People aren't using it. So it's kind of going to vary there. I don't think there is a hard and fast rule about how long it's going to take to go from setup to rollout. In terms of like the tech side, quite quick. Create your labels, give it 24 hours to roll out, and then you're good to go start using them. It's the cultural change, the business change that's going to take a lot longer. And knowing what you know about these, work out whether you go big bang, roll it all out in one hit, make it mandatory, or whether you go pilot set of users. Let's pilot with the users, both the guidance and the actual adoption, see how they go, make adjustments to the guidance, roll it out with a bigger set of users, see how they go, and then roll it out across the org because you'll already have some business champions to lean on to make it an easier experience. I don't know if that answered your question, Fernando, but that's sort of my gauge on it. Should clarify. I have rarely seen this used in the data platform out in the wild world. In my demo tenant, it's used all the time. In actual organizations, they're very behind. There's some of them are only just getting to the point of doing it for emails, and I sort of hint at them going, hey, you can do it for data platform. Even the ones that don't have it enabled, I let them know. Today, I had a team I'm working with, and they're going through a bit of a PII audit, personally identifiable information. And they were looking at third-party tools, and I said, well, SQL Server, you can just right-click the database and say classify, basically. It's a few menus in, but classify, and then it will automatically try and detect both what the column is, its type, like financial, confidential, date of birth, name, and then what sensitivity label it should apply. So they were like, oh, I had no idea this feature existed. And then their audit is going to be a lot shorter because they have tooling to help them. Do they apply to, very good question. Do they apply to Power Apps, Dataverse, related Power Platform artifacts? I actually can't answer that. It's in my to-do bucket to try out. I can get back to you at a later date if you want to ping me via my blog or via Twitter, and I'll try it out in my demo tenant and let you know, because the other thing I'm keen to see is with the fact that Power BI can be embedded in PowerPoint and both of those have sensitivity labels, is what happens. Does the Power BI let PowerPoint have the content if it's a higher priority label? Does it have the content and display the label? Does it take the PowerPoint's label on the Power BI portion? I don't know, but I'm keen to try it out. So if you'd like to see that, I don't have it in this slide deck, but I'm happy to try it out in my demo space, because I'm pretty sure I've got some Power Apps and I do have a database in one of them. But I will switch back and keep going. But feel free, keep the questions coming. These are great. Oops, I've gone one back, one forward, two forward. There we go. Right. So the other thing to be aware of is there are other options. One is around sensitivity label from data sources. The other one is around downstream content. So let's say you have a data set that's got confidential applied. People start building reports off that. You can automatically have Power BI say, hey, I want to take the data set label and put it on any reports people build from the get-go. So it automatically applies it to downstream content. Of course, people can go and update it and change it. That report may have a different rating. You might be containing or consuming public data as well as confidential data. So your report may take a confidential label because that's a higher priority one. In my tenant, it's a higher priority one, but it's something to consider. You may want to turn that on. So if you do the classifications at the data set label level, have that flowing through to the report. So what does it look like in the service once I do have labeling? If I'm looking at a workspace in list view, I will see there's a sensitivity column there that's going to show us the label. We can also see it in the lineage view. You'll see the little sensitivity label icon appears against all artifacts that it can be tied to. You notice how the workbook doesn't have it because it's not applicable for a workbook, even though Excel has it. Workbooks in Power BI, which are Excel files published up, nope, doesn't like it. So once you're inside service, if you're an end user and you want to know what label's been applied, you want to look up the top and you'll see that the sensitivity label appears after the pipe symbol next to the name of the report itself. And then if you were to click the little drop down and you get the tile information about the report, you'll see the sensitivity label at the bottom there. So you can see it in both places. So if you're thinking about users consuming sensitivity labeled content, this is how they're going to see it. Datamarts also allow you to have the sensitivity label, but with the Datamart, because you're creating it inside the service, the way to apply the label is through the settings. So within the settings on a Datamart, you can apply the sensitivity label there, and that list will be the list that your logged in account has access to. Something to be aware of, even though Datamarts are kind of like Azure SQL under the hood, and we'll talk about Azure SQL in depth in a little bit, it's not the same in that Azure SQL lets you apply the sensitivity label down to the column. Datamarts, being inside Power BI, only have one sensitivity label at the artifact level. So you can't go any granular than that. So when you are looking to apply labeling, just realize that a Datamart, even though you've got columns that are different labels, it has to be at the Datamart level. As far as I'm aware, that's not changing anytime soon. With a dashboard, because it's getting consumed from something else, you're creating it for a report, you will see a little tooltip type thing to let you know that the sensitivity label is being taken from where you're creating the dashboard from, because I have the downstream content enabled. But if I wanted to look at a dashboard once it is created, I can see the same thing as I would a report. It's in the title up the top, and it's in the little tile. If I want to change the sensitivity label at any point in time, I can go into the settings and adjust the label inside the settings for a dashboard. Paginated reports, two gotchas with paginated reports. If you're in the Power BI report builder, you go to get data, you say, I want a golden data set, I'm going to get it from service. No data set will have the sensitivity label. So even though this is coming from that workspace you saw earlier, which has sensitivity labels, it's not showing them inside the Paginated report builder. So if you've got users creating reports and you want them to take that into consideration, make sure you inform them that they'll have to go see what it looks like in the service to know which data sets are applicable for their request that they might be actioning. The other thing is there's nowhere in the tooling, there's no ribbon item that says sensitivity label, there's no properties that say sensitivity label. So this is just to show you in screenshot form, there is no real way that I've seen to apply a sensitivity label here, similar like you would in desktop or Excel. But once you're inside Power BI service, you've published the report up, a little one down the bottom here, you can go into the settings of that and toggle the sensitivity label at that point. So then once I do have that, I might look at data flows. Data flows like Datamart, it's a bit like Groundhog Day. You will see that, when you create one, they don't have a sensitivity label there, but you can go ahead into settings and apply the sensitivity label. Notice how even though settings is like applicable to all artifacts, the screen is different. So sometimes it's the pane that pops out from the right, other times it switches screens entirely. Like this one where you see, you've got the different menu structure up the top and you can see the list of data flows and you can go into settings and change them. So it gets a bit fun when you're trying to find where the sensitivity labels are. You apply the label, export to Excel. If you were in a Power BI report, I should precast that with, let's rewind just slightly. Where security does not apply, even though the sensitivity label is applied to a Power BI artifact, and I might say, all right, only finance can access this sensitivity label, anyone who has access to that workspace can see those reports. So there's no security when it comes to like the Power BI side of things. It's not like Office. So Power BI just goes, I've got my security model and you're just a label. But when it comes to export to Excel, Excel goes, hang on a jiffy, I have security in my context. So I will check if that person has access to the content. And if they don't, I will not open the Excel file. So this is the experience you'll get if you don't have access. It also happens if your Excel happens to be signed in as a different account. So in this case, I've got my little Tim McGee account. Tim has no access to the confidential label. I could simply re-log in with a different account that has access to the label. If it's a user error, I've logged in under the wrong tenant. Otherwise, you get nothing. And that's okay. But that's the only little bit of security that kind of applies when it comes to the data platform. The last time I tested it, they are making changes all the time. So the other gotcha with Excel files. Excel files, as you can see here, my little one down the bottom has a sensitivity label applied. I publish that up to the service. It's a workbook and the service just goes, I don't care, no label. So service does not recognize the sensitivity label on an Excel workbook. So just be aware of that. It'll just always say dash. Even like you can see I've ticked confidential, it'll just say dash. There is no option there. If I had the downstream content enabled, which I do at my tenant, I've gone in, I have my data set here, it's got confidential. I go say I want to build a report off that. Automatically, it's giving me that little tooltip bit to say, hey, this data set has a sensitivity label of confidential, therefore I'm going to apply that to your report. You can change it after the fact, but I'm going to apply it by default. And as you saw earlier, it puts it in the little title bar area, and it will put it in any other locations like the column in the list view. If we were in Excel and we wanted to analyze a Power BI data set, so we've gone from Excel, we say, hey, we're going to consume from Power BI. It's great. It knows their sensitivity labels. It tells the user what the sensitivity labels are, and it doubles down and says, you've picked one, so now I'm going to apply that label to your Excel file. So you can see you get the policy tip warning, and it now appears in the little status bar. So if you've got your users building off your Power BI content, you probably want that downstream feature enabled, so then it starts to apply the label to any Excel file that's running around the place. So we talked about the fact there is no real security tied into it. If you're exporting to Excel, you are going to have a little bit of security tied in. If you've got multiple labels, so if you're doing a bit of a data mashup, the one with the highest priority when it's in that label definition, the highest priority is the one that it's going to pick. You can, of course, change it later, but just be aware. And because it is Office 365 tied, it's defined in Office 365, B2B, business to business, and multi-tenant scenarios are not supported. So even though you can share content from Power BI out to other organizations, that scenario is not supported when it comes to sensitivity labels. Do I know exactly what happens when you do that? Nope. Another thing on my to-do list to test out. Another gotcha, if you create a sensitivity label, you apply it to a Power BI desktop file, you publish it up to service, and you experience this. Sensitivity label cannot be loaded. My gut feel is I did it a bit too quick between creating the label and it rolling out everywhere. So I just went into the settings and applied the label directly. So if you do get that sort of warning, just go in and check. The label may be there. It's just a case of timing, because I think I did this within like a 4-hour window and it's just 24. Other things to consider: check out the Microsoft Docs all the time, because the considerations and limitations change so often that you might evaluate it today and go, you know what, it's not good enough for my org. It's 80%. I want it at 90. Or it might be, no, given the gotchas, we're going to use the labeling in this way. But because this is ever changing, it's important to just review that from time to time. If you evaluate today and go, you know what, it's not at a point where we want to put it on the data platform, we'll put it on Office 365. 6 months' time, you look back and you go, you know what, it's got some more security considerations, the whole data loss protection stuff. Let's have a look at it in again, and then go, okay, now it's in a position where we want to look at it. Azure SQL, over to the Azure side of the fence. And this is where we kind of disconnect from Office 365, sadly. At this point, we've gone rogue. Well, not rogue. I think they kind of had it first. But Azure SQL goes, hey, I'm all for sensitivity labels. You'll find it's under classification, and you can apply it right down to the column level. But you notice this list here looks a bit different to what you've seen in the previous screenshots. It is still the same tenant in a way, because Office 365 is a tenant, Azure is a tenant, is an org tenant, they interchange. But what happens is when you're in the Azure portal, you navigate to your Azure SQL resource. Now I'm using a straight Azure SQL PASDB, so this is not an MI or anything, this example, but my understanding is it's the same. You can select the security, data discovery and classification, and then you can go ahead and add, and this left pane is what you're going to see with the add. My understanding is you can do it straight through to SQL as well, because a lot of times these sorts of features are actually extended properties on columns. But it's not the Office 365 list. It's a totally different list. It's managed within the Azure portal itself. But we do get cool features once we have applied it. So what you hadn't seen me there do is I'm going to apply a sensitivity label to a specific column. So I'm actually going to do it to 2 columns in the customer table. Once I've applied that, I can look at it in terms of my whole database. So I can look at my whole database and go, right, well, how many columns are classified overall and what classification is it? So I can not only see my lower level detail going, this table, this column has this sensitivity label on the right here. I can also see holistically, right, we've got, 50 things classified, or we've got 0. So you get that. Good for if you have auditors come in and do reviews, or if you've got security people or governance people that want to know, hey, what's our data estate look like? You've got these sorts of features to give you insights. You can get them from the DMVs as well. So if I want to pull that out programmatically, I may have, third-party tooling. I want to grab that information and go, let's look, out of all the columns we have, how many are classified? What classification are we using? Sort of, and you might want to change them. Tomorrow you might say email address has gone from confidential to public. Go through and change them. So you can see all that there. If you wanted to add additional sensitivity labels, you would do that through the portal. So again, back into our SQL resource in security data discovery and configure. So that's where it's slightly different. A question from the chat, can you set the labels in Azure SQL from T-SQL code? Now, I have not tested this myself, but my gut feeling is yes, because if you think about it, it's DMVs. DMVs means it's stored somewhere. And the last time I remember when they did, it wasn't dynamic data masking, it was when they initially rolled out data classifications in SSMS for on-prem SQL Server, but at the time Azure SQL existed, it created it and put it in an extended property. So my gut feel is it's going to do the same here. I just have not got it in the slide deck to confirm in my head what it does. But given you can pull it from DFPs, I would say so. Does this apply? Question from the chat. Does this apply to Azure Synapse too? I would love to be able to answer that question, but given when I span up Purview to do this to do these screenshots, I spend a couple of $100 scanning my state. Synapse is not one I've tried yet. I will add that to my to-do bucket. Fernando, you're adding all this stuff to my to-do bucket. It's great. I had not considered what it looks like in Synapse, so not covered in this session, but let me see if I can follow up with that. Because
in SQL, and it's actually in SQL everywhere, on premise, everything. You just do add sensitivity specification to, and then the object, either it's a table or a column or whatever, with label equals, etc., etc. So it's add sensitivity classification.
Bitty, there you go. Problem solved. Now, question: Am I going to SQL Bits? Virtually, I'm going. Virtually, I'm going. I've not been to SQL Bits in person. It's on my bucket list, but everyone tells me if you're going to go and it's your first time to that area of the world, have a bit of a holiday at the same time. I tend to use my 4 weeks of annual leave for conferences, so Bits is on my radar. I just need to have more leave to do it in person. So this year I'm going to be virtual. Last year I was virtual. Maybe in the future. Past, maybe, I don't know. They're going in person. Power Platform Conference, I want to see that one too. That's in Vegas in October. If you're ever down, my area of the world, New Zealand has a great conference called Definity. I'm usually at that one in person. Right. Oh, I better keep going. Keep going. We got it. We still got to get to Purview, but great questions. Keep them coming. So Azure SQL done that. Labels not attached to Office 365. Key point that I'm pointing that out and making emphasis is because of Purview. So with Purview, there are two sort of things to consider: viewing sensitivity labels and automatically applying them. I'm not going to cover automatically applying because I think that's a whole nother session in itself. Also, when I tried it, I failed. So I sort of stopped there because I had enough content, but something to look into. So when you're in Purview, if you've never seen Purview, I've gone ahead and scanned all those things you saw earlier. So I put my Excel file in blob storage and I scanned blob storage. Pretty sure it was blob, might have been file. I scanned my Power BI estate, I scanned my Azure SQL estate, and this is what came out of that. So within Azure Purview, in the data catalog is where you're going to see the information about your assets and the sensitivity label. So if we go in, we get this cool thing down the bottom left, which is the ability to filter on the sensitivity label. But you'll also see here next to every single artifact is the sensitivity label for that artifact. And what's interesting when you go into them is that with the Power BI side of things, it doesn't display it as like a property or an overview. It actually displays it next to the title. So next to the name of the actual artifact is where it's going to display the sensitivity label. Almost looks like a rounded button, just a label. So you can think about that from your users looking at Purview to understand what data they've got within the org and what they can use for their reporting. They'll have a look here and go, oh, this one's confidential. I can't use it for this public submission we're trying to respond to. Datasets looks the same. We're back at Groundhog Day again. Datasets displayed next to the title. And workbooks. Workbooks, they just get no love from Purview. Like you thought Power BI was bad where it's not showing the sensitivity label. Purview just doesn't care about them at all. So you can see here we've got a workspace with a workbook, and Purview scanned it. It's like ghosted. It's just ghosted. So just be aware of that. If you've got users, if you're using the workbook feature in Power BI and you're using Purview for your data cataloging, your data governance, just be aware that workbooks disappear. I don't believe that's changed, but something to be aware of. And then Azure SQL, another little disappearing act. Sensitivity labels, gone. So this is that same table. This is a customer table, which you saw earlier that I had 2 sensitivity labels on, and Purview just goes, I know nothing about them. Now, my take on that is that Purview is only respecting labels from Office 365. And because Azure SQL is not pulling its sensitivity labels from Office 365, it has them defined itself. That's why this doesn't show them. However, you can see one column to the left where the classification has values. If you use the auto labeling, where it looks at the classification and then works out what label to apply, the auto labeling is a bit different because the auto labeling can then go, hey, I think this label from Azure SQL should have this sensitivity label. So be aware of that, because if you start using auto labeling and it starts putting a different label on than what you've put in Azure SQL, then you're going to get different user experience between the two sets of tooling, because someone might look at Purview to see what labels applied and start using it in that context and not know that Azure SQL has a different label applied. So that's a good one to be aware of. The blob storage one was interesting because I actually loaded an Excel. I gave an Excel file a sensitivity label, the one you saw earlier, had no data in it, put it in storage, scanned it, nothing, absolutely nothing. I put the exact same file with, well, not exactly the same. I take the file, I make a copy, I put like a row of data in, I put that in storage, I rescan, that one shows me the label. Empty file does not show me the label. Now, that may not be a problem for your org, because what's the chances you're going to put an empty Excel file in storage and want that to appear in Purview with a label? But if you've got templates maybe that your users fill in to do sort of write back scenarios or data entry input, so just be aware that a file that's empty is probably going to come up as no label, but you put some data in that, it seems to behave differently. Insights, just like Azure SQL. Now, this screenshot is not from my tenant, it's from the Microsoft Docs, link down the bottom. But within Purview, if you want to see holistically across all your assets, so everything you've scanned, whether that be Power BI, Azure SQL, storage, you'll see that here in this insight section. So you can go into sensitivity labels and get that holistic view of how many labels have we applied, what's it applied to, what labeling are we doing. And I think that's really good for people within your org that are doing information governance, because they can go, oh, look, everyone's got unclassified. No one's actually using the labeling. That means we need to improve the comms and the user guidance and the training and start, monitoring it a bit more to say, hey, people, we want you to use these things for this reason. We need to know where things are sensitive of nature so that if we get audited or we get reviewed, we can look at it. Or if we're changing our security to say, hey, anything that's PII is going to be masked, we want to know what PII artifacts we have so that we can appropriately apply masking to them. So that's a really good thing for you to be able to see how your strategy is going. And to your question earlier, Fernando, these sorts of things are things you can look at to go, how is it working in terms of our rollout? Are we at the point where we can sort of set and forget for a little bit? Or is it, no, we need to start having regular catch-ups with our users like lunch and learns or little workshops and training days, or change our onboarding experience for new staff to cover off the use of labels. So we talked about licensing earlier. These are the links to get a bit more detail specific to your org. Always check what your licensing is. And in some cases, if you do have an E5, great. If you don't, talk to your licensing partners about what your options are to then access the features. If you are playing with Azure SQL and you want to look at that, here's some more details for that. And if you want to look into the auto labeling with Purview, which I think is quite powerful, but it's like anything, it can't do everything for you. It can only do an extent. It's got a series of rules. A computer can only do it what you tell it to do. With the exception of AI, it can go off and do extra things. But so in order to auto label, it has to have rules. It applies the rules, it applies a label. It might apply entirely the wrong label for you. Like I saw today, if you write credit in a column name, like think credit card, but you write something else like credit balance, it automatically wants to call it financial and confidential. Not this auto labeling, but just the tooling that I've seen with some of the Microsoft stack. But you go, it's just a credit balance. Credit card, yes, I want that to be sensitive. Other things like amount. If that amount column is prefixed with something that might be a bit sensitive, hey, I think it's this and confidential. Emails. It thinks they're confidential because, which, they may be for your organization. So always review the auto labeling because it might not match what you want as an organization. So to recap what we covered, we looked at the maintenance and management of within O365 about those labels because they do fall in that space other than Azure SQL. We looked at what they appear like in Power BI, in Office, in Azure SQL, in Azure Purview, and a couple of the gotchas. Now, that's only my experience playing with the product in my little demo tenant and what I'm seeing out there in the world and what I've experienced from working in organizations that use it in the space of email. So it's just sort of my 50,000 foot view. And from this, I have like 4 other things to try out, which is going to be fun. Thank you. Thank you for having me. You can find me on Twitter. Like I said, you can reach out to my blog, send me questions. I am one of these people who loves to try things out all the time. So, and I'm in another time zone, so you can email me, message me. And this is the assortment of colors I've had over the years because I had one conference where someone couldn't find me because they looked at my Twitter photo, which is my red hair. And at that conference, I had purple hair, so they totally missed me in the hallways. And I had short hair for so long. It's only been like the last 2 years. It's actually grown longer. But thank you. And thanks for sticking around. If you do have questions, fire away. I apologize that I can't answer all of them, but I will try. Or Magnus will answer them.
Great session.
Oh, that is cool.
I think that's it actually with the hair. I told you when we met in Seattle that you probably changed hair color since I met you the time before, which obviously is true. But I think you let it grow. That was the big difference because I have a daughter
Yes.
who is changing hair colors weekly, and it's like, oh, it's still you, okay.
I know it's so much fun. I used to have this sort of semi rule in my head to go every international conference, I'm changing my hair. So I went to a few. I went to like 5 in a year. So I change them every time. And when you have short hair, you can do that really easily. You know, it's like bleach, change. People are like, doesn't it destroy your hair? I'm like, well, when it's short hair, not really, because I'm cutting it off and then changing color. Now
Yeah.
that I have longer hair, I had the same color for almost a year.
Oh,
That
so
was rare. That's rare.
how depressing, right?
I was like, and then people think I have blonde hair naturally. I actually have brown hair naturally. But yeah, I changed it. I was like, I want to add blue, so we put this section of blue in. So now I have like 3 different colors. But
But you gotta bleach it first to make the color stick.
only only the blue bit was beached in this round because we could put the red and the pink over the top of my faded. My pink hair fades to like a peach. And so we could just put so that color that's in this photo, this bigger photo, that was what
Mm,
it was, kind of. And then so we only bleached the section with that we wanted the blue in. The rest we just threw the color over the top.
all
But it
right.
means that I can't drastically change colors. Like I've gone from red over to blue. Oh, I actually had green and yellow hair. The first time they did it, I'm not gonna lie, I looked like a budgie because the way they did the coloring. And I was like, oh, because they colored it beautifully, but then they cut it too much. So it was a lot more yellow and little patches of green. It looked hilarious. I should put that in here.
I just
But
wish I could. I mean, I could, of course, color these 4 or 5 hairs that I have here, but it's
you can color the beard.
yeah, that's true. I did promise my daughter I'd
Oh,
uh, color my mustache pink next time I come to school, and she said, "I'm not going to recognize you as my dad, so don't do it."
you should see this. So when I don't wear glasses very often because I actually need contact lenses, but it took me hours to pick out glasses because I changed my hair color so often. So I had to pick glasses that were going to work with the different hair colors. So I have these nice bright glasses when I do wear them.
All right, yeah, I don't have that problem then.
It was fun though. It was fun. It's always fun. It's fun to have different hair colors. It's something I do, you know.
Yeah,
Everyone has their things. Like my tech toys, people laugh at me for all my tech toys. Like in my house, I have a Wi-Fi enabled kettle. So I can sit at my desk and turn the kettle on. And people are like, what do you need that for? I'm like, so I can keep working and then only it's optimal making a cup of tea. I keep working until it's boiled and then I walk in the kitchen.
I
These
mean,
are
my
these
answer
lights are
would
all
be
like,
because I can.
ah, I love it. Anything I see that's Wi-Fi enabled, I'm like, the washing machine, Wi-Fi enabled. Yeah, love it.
Or
Lights is Wi-Fi enabled.
I have with the new parts of the house, we added lots of lightning that is using. Well, I can turn them on and off with an app. I can set the timing for them so that when I'm traveling, they go on randomly or stuff like that. So it's supposed to be for burglary protection, but for me, it's mostly fun. So
I know. I want to work out how to get the data. I have the little outdoor what they call they're like plant monitor things, but they take the humidity, the soil moisture sensor, the light, and everything. They're on
mm,
Bluetooth, and I'm like, there's got to be a way to get. They're probably smarter people than me have figured this out. I'm sure. There's got to be a way to get that data and bring it in, so I can analyze all my plants and work out which ones need more water and not. Because
mm,
I have to go into the app and look at the sensor and go, oh yeah, 60%, soil moisture. I'll water them for a bit longer today. I set the app going remotely. My sister has a laugh at me because she set up my watering system and I wanted the Wi-Fi enabled tap timer. And she's like, you can do it manually, Hides. And I'm like, yep. But when I'm away, because I travel a lot, I can
yeah.
turn on and water my plants remotely. And then I have the security cameras to be able to see them visually to go, oh, they're looking a bit droopy. Give them more water. It's great. Technology.
Yeah, true. With this new office room that I built for myself, I set up this one.
Oh, the green screen.
Yeah.
Oh, jealous.
So now that I have it, I obviously need better lighting. So it's going to be another, few $100s in lighting, and I need a better camera, so. And when my wife asked, "What do you mean you need?" Well, okay, I want it then.
No, it's essential.
IKEA just came to me, so I need to go and let them in. So
oh no!
thank you
Lucky
so much
timing.
for coming, Heidi. Sorry for going off in a rush, but
all good. Now reach out to me, anyone, if you have questions or you want to follow up or you